There is a page in every small-town newspaper that nobody reads. It is near the back, past the school sports, and the church suppers and the 2-for-1 tire coupon. It is set in 6-point type in 3 narrow columns, and it is called Legal Notices, and it costs about $40 an inch. Foreclosures live there. Name changes, estate creditors, zoning variances, somebody's abandoned storage unit. The entire page is written in a language designed to be boring. And here is the thing about that. It is boring on purpose, and it is boring in the way a fuse is boring. Nothing about a fuse tells you what it is attached to. 4 people in Dunkirk County read that page every single week without fail. A title clerk, a retired judge who does it out of habit, a woman at a surety bond agency in Columbus whose entire job is scanning for one specific phrase, and an underwriter at the Ohio Department of Transportation. I'm Nathan. I want you to hold on to that. Because the man in this story got fired at 9:40 on a Tuesday morning by his own father-in-law in front of a board of directors, told he'd get nothing by the wife sitting next to him, and given 1 hour to clear out. He used 30 minutes of it. He said goodbye to nobody. He drove home, and the single most destructive thing he did that entire day cost him $384 and took 11 minutes at a newspaper counter. Soren Vandenberg was 44 years old, and he could look at a bridge and hear it. That is not a figure of speech, and he had stopped explaining it to people around 30. Certain men who spend 20 years inside a discipline stop doing arithmetic and start doing something closer to listening. They see a girder and a bearing pad and a skew angle, and something in the back of the skull goes, "That's fine." Or, "That's not fine." And then they go and do the arithmetic afterward to find out why they were right. He had learned it from his father. Tobin Vandenberg had been an iron worker for 31 years and had never gone past the 10th grade, and had walked steel on 9 bridges in 3 states, and had told his son exactly one thing about the profession that mattered. The bridge does not care what anybody in the office wants. Tobin died when Soren was 26, 4 months before Soren sat for the professional engineer exam. Soren passed it on the first attempt with a score he never told anybody, and he framed the license and hung it in a rented garage in Ipswich Falls, Ohio, with a folding table under it, and that garage was Vandenberg Structural. For 6 years it was him and a truck and a laptop and a plate scanner. He did the work nobody wanted, which in structural engineering means the small, ugly rural stuff. County load ratings, culvert replacements, scour analysis on a 100-year-old pony truss over a creek that floods twice a spring. He drove 90,000 miles a year. He inspected bridges by climbing them, in a harness, in February, because a bridge does not care what anybody in the office wants. And he got a reputation, which in that business is 1 sentence long and takes a decade to earn. Soren Vandenberg's sentence was, "He'll tell you no." By 34 he had 11 people. By 38 he had 31. A real building on Kesterline Road, and a pre-qualification with the Ohio Department of Transportation for structural design and construction management on projects up to $40 million. That pre-qualification is the whole ballgame in that industry, and it takes years to get, and it is attached. This matters more than anything else in this story, so hold it. It is attached to people, not to a company. A construction and engineering firm that does public work is a license wrapped in a corporation, and the license lives inside a human being. Hugo Musgrave arrived in the spring Soren turned 39. He arrived the way that kind of man always arrives, through a daughter. Soren met Bryony Musgrave at a fundraiser he did not want to attend, in a rented tent, and she was the only person there who asked him an actual question about what he did, and the question was good. She had a degree in art history, and a laugh that arrived a half beat before the joke landed, and within 4 months, Soren Vandenberg, who had been alone since a bad thing in his 20s he never discussed, was completely, straightforwardly in love with her. They married 11 months later. Their daughter Elowen was born the following spring, and Hugo Musgrave, who owned 6 car dealerships and a strip of commercial property along Route 9, and who had spent 30 years being the biggest man in a small county, looked at his son-in-law's company and saw something he wanted. Understand, Hugo was not a criminal. There is no fraud in this story, not $1 of it. And that is exactly what makes it worth telling. Hugo Musgrave was a dealer. He had built a life out of buying a thing for less than it was worth from somebody who needed money on a Thursday, and he had never in his life encountered a machine he did not believe he could operate. The offer came in year 2 of the marriage, and it was, on paper, a gift. Vandenberg Structural was doing well and was dying of it. Public work pays on 90-day cycles, and you carry payroll the whole time. Grow too fast, and you drown in your own success with a full order book. Soren needed working capital and a bonding line, and he needed them that year. Hugo put in $2.6 million. For that, he took 49% of the company, 2 of 5 board seats, and a security interest in the receivables. Soren kept 51, and everybody at the closing table shook hands, and Soren's attorney at the time, a decent man in a bad suit, said one sentence that Soren remembered for the rest of his life, which was, "Control isn't the same as votes." Here is how a man loses 51% of a company without selling a single share. He does not lose it. He simply stops being able to use it. Hugo took 2 seats, Briony took 1, as a courtesy, because she was family and because she had been doing the firm's marketing since year 1 and had genuinely built the brand. That was 3 votes that had dinner together every Sunday. Soren had his own vote and the 5th seat, which went to an outside director both sides approved. For 4 years none of it mattered, because the company was making money and everybody was happy, and Soren was doing what he had always done, which was work. He hired. He built a bridge inspection division. He took on Niall Oglesby, a foreman out of Local 44 with hands like catcher's mitts and a genius for sequencing, and the 2 of them together were worth more than any 6 people in that building. Then, in the 5th year, the company won the Kesterline River crossing. It was the biggest thing Soren had ever touched. A state route bridge replacement. $38 million. 410 feet of continuous steel plate girder over a river that had eaten 2 previous bridges. Design build. Which meant one firm, his, carried both the design and the construction, which meant one licensed professional engineer, sealed the drawings and stood behind every calculation in them personally, with his own license, for the life of the structure. Soren Vandenberg sealed those drawings. His name, his number, his stamp. Not the company's. A corporation cannot practice engineering in Ohio. Only a person can. The company holds a certificate of authorization, and that certificate is valid only while a full-time licensed engineer is designated as the one responsible for the practice. There is a form for it. It is 1 page, and on that form, in the box marked, Designated Engineer. Since the year the garage on Kesterline Road had a folding table in it, there had only ever been one name. The trouble started, as it always does, with a number that was fine. In the 6th year, the market softened. 2 big private jobs got shelved. Revenue came in at $31 million against a projection of 38, which is a bad year and is not remotely a crisis. And Soren said so at the October board meeting in about 90 seconds and moved on to the next item. Hugo Musgrave did not move on. Hugo had spent 30 years in a business where a bad quarter means you fire the sales manager, and he had been sitting on a board for 5 years watching his son-in-law turn down work. Because Soren turned down work. Constantly. It was the sentence he had earned. He had walked away from a $9 million parking structure because the geotech was garbage and the owner wouldn't pay to redo it. He had refused to bid a marina expansion for a developer everybody in 3 counties knew paid at 180 days. He had, twice, pulled his own firm off jobs mid-design and eaten the fee. To Soren, these were the whole point of the company. To Hugo Musgrave, they were $7 million of revenue that a coward had thrown in a ditch. And somewhere in that 6th year, at some Sunday dinner Soren was not at because he was in a harness under a bridge in Guernsey County, the 3 votes that had dinner together every week began to discuss what this company could be if it were run by somebody who understood business. Killian Roundtree came in as a consultant in February. Hugo introduced him as a growth guy. He was 41. He had very good teeth. He had run operations at a mechanical contractor in Cincinnati that had been sold twice, and he had a business card that said PE after his name. Soren noticed the PE the way a pilot notices a wing. He looked it up that night, because that is what you do. The Ohio Board's license lookup is public. It takes 11 seconds, and every engineer in the state has it bookmarked whether they admit it or not. Killian Roundtree's Ohio professional engineer license had lapsed in 2019 for failure to complete continuing education and had never been reinstated. He was, at that moment, legally entitled to use those 2 letters in exactly 0 states. Soren mentioned it once, privately, to Brianny, in their kitchen, without heat. He genuinely thought it was an oversight and that the man would want to know. Brianny said, "Are you seriously going to make that a thing?" He would replay that sentence approximately 900 times over the following year, because it was the first moment he had incontrovertible evidence that he and his wife were no longer on the same side of anything, and he did not recognize it, because it arrived in the shape of an ordinary irritation between 2 tired people at a kitchen counter. He let it go. Killian was in the building 3 days a week by April. What he did there, technically, was process improvement. What he actually did was learn the company, the schedules, the margins, the pay apps, the change orders, the names of the people who mattered, with the specific, patient thoroughness of a man taking an engine apart to find out how many bolts hold it together. By June, he had an office. By August, he was on the agenda at board meetings. By October, he had a title, Chief Operating Officer, which Soren voted against and lost 3-2. And by January of the following year, Niall Oglesby came into Soren's office, shut the door, stood there for a while, and said, "You're going to want to sit down for this one, boss." He had seen Killian Roundtree's truck at the Musgrave place at 11:40 at night. Twice. On nights Hugo and Honora were in Florida. Soren said, "Okay." Niall said, "That's it? Okay?" And Soren Vandenberg, who had spent 20 years learning to sit with a number he did not like before he decided what it meant, said, "I need 3 things I can point at. Right now I have 1, and it's a truck." He got the other 2 inside a month, and they were both worse than the truck. The first was that Brianny had stopped putting her phone face down, which is the opposite of what people expect, and it took Soren 2 weeks to work out why, because there was nothing on it anymore. She had moved everything somewhere else. A woman who is hiding something puts her phone face down. A woman who has finished hiding it doesn't have to. The second was a resolution in the January board packet. It was item 9 of 11, 4 lines long, and it authorized the officers of the corporation to execute such filings with regulatory and licensing authorities as may be necessary in the ordinary course. Soren read it 4 times. There was nothing wrong with it. It was standard. It was the kind of housekeeping language every board passes, except that Vandenberg Structural had exactly 1 filing with a licensing authority that mattered, and it had exactly 1 name on it, and there was no ordinary course reason on God's earth to think about it in January. They were going to swap the designated engineer. And the moment Soren understood that, he understood the rest of it in about 4 seconds, standing in his own conference room, holding a stapled packet, and what he felt was not rage. What he felt was the specific, quiet vertigo of a man who realizes he has been reading the wrong drawing for a year. Because here is what they thought they were doing. Hugo Musgrave believed, genuinely, not cynically, that his son-in-law was a technician, a very good one, a guy with a stamp, and that a company is a machine made of contracts and receivables and relationships, and that the guy with the stamp is a part of that machine, and that parts are sourced. He believed he could fire the engineer and hire another engineer, because that is what you do with an engine part. Killian Roundtree believed it too, because Killian had never in his life run a design-build public project, and had spent his career at a firm where the engineering was somebody else's floor. And Brianny believed it because her father did. None of the 3 of them had ever read the 1-page form. Soren spent the next 5 weeks doing something he never told anybody about at the time, which was nothing. He went to work. He sealed drawings. He drove to Guernsey County. He took Elowen to swim on Thursdays and helped her with a project on the water cycle that involved a great deal of blue food coloring. And in the evenings, at the kitchen table after everyone was asleep, he read. He read the Ohio Revised Code, Chapter 4733, which governs the practice of engineering, and the administrative rules under it. He read his own certificate of authorization. He read the ODOT pre-qualification regulations, all 61 pages. He read the design-build contract for the Kesterline River crossing, all 406 pages. including the appendices, which he had signed and never once fully read, because he had been busy building the thing it described. He read the bond forms. He read his own operating agreement, and his own shareholder agreement, and his own employment agreement, which he had signed at a kitchen table when he was 39 and in love. And what he found, over 5 weeks, was not a weapon. It was an inventory. Because Soren Vandenberg did not need to do anything to them at all. He simply needed to understand, precisely, what he was holding. And then, when the moment came, to stop holding it, correctly, in writing, on time. Item 1. The Certificate of Authorization. An Ohio firm may not offer or practice engineering without a full-time licensed engineer designated as responsible. If that engineer separates, the firm has 30 days to designate a replacement, and if it cannot, the certificate is suspended. Every sealed drawing already issued stays valid. Every drawing not yet sealed cannot be issued at all. Item 2. The Engineer of Record. On a design-build project, the EOR is a named individual in the contract. Kesterline had one named individual, and it was him. Changing an EOR mid-project requires the owner's written approval, a full transfer of professional responsibility, and, this is the part nobody outside the industry knows, an incoming engineer willing to accept responsibility for another man's calculations on a bridge that is half built. Item 3. The Pre-Qualification. ODOT pre-qualifies firms based on the qualifications of key personnel. Remove the personnel, and the firm falls out of the category it pre-qualified in, and every active contract in that category becomes subject to review. Item 4. The Surety. The bonds on Kesterline, a $38 million performance bond and a payment bond, had been written on the strength of a submission that named Soren Vandenberg 11 times. Every surety bond carries a change of control and a key personnel clause. Every one. Nobody ever reads them because nobody ever needs to. Item 5, and this was the one he sat with for a long time in a dark kitchen. His employment agreement had a non-compete in it. 2 years, 90 miles, standard, and it was void the second they fired him without cause. Ohio courts will not enforce a non-compete against an employee terminated without cause, and Hugo Musgrave, who had never lost an argument in his life, was constitutionally incapable of firing anybody quietly for cause. He was going to do it in a room, in front of people, because that was the point. Soren closed the codebook at about 2 in the morning in the middle of March and sat there for a while. Then he did 3 things. He called Jessamy Weiss, a business litigator in Columbus, who had been recommended by a man he trusted, and he paid her a retainer out of an account with his own name on it. And he told her everything, and she listened for 2 hours and then said, "Mr. Vandenberg, you understand you're describing a situation where you do almost nothing." "Yes. Most people find that unsatisfying. Most people," said Soren, "have not spent 20 years watching things fall down because somebody was in a hurry." The second thing he did was drive to Columbus and sit down with Ulrich Goodloe, the underwriter at the surety agency, ostensibly about renewal capacity for the following year, and ask a single hypothetical question with a completely flat face. What happens to an active bond if the named professional of record separates from the principal? Ulrich Goodloe put down his pen. He said, "Soren, is that a hypothetical?" And Soren said, "For now." The third thing he did was drive to the offices of the Dunkirk County Register, which is a twice-weekly paper with a circulation of 11,000, and speak to a woman at the front counter about the rate card for legal notices, and the deadline for the Wednesday edition, and whether a notice could be placed in advance and held. It could. The deadline was 4 p.m. Monday. The rate was $41 a column inch. He did not place anything. He wrote it, and he put it in a folder, and he went back to work. It is worth understanding what Bryony Musgrave was, because the easy version of this story makes her a villain who was always a villain, and that is both untrue and much less frightening than what actually happened. She was not a plant. She did not marry Soren Vandenberg to take his company. Anyone who tells you otherwise has not thought about it for more than 11 seconds, because a woman executing that plan does not spend 6 years building a brand, sitting through highway conferences in Sandusky, Or learning the difference between a plate girder and a box girder well enough to write copy about it. She did all three. Bryony was the youngest of Hugo Musgrave's 3 children and the only one who had stayed. And being Hugo's daughter in Dunkirk County meant a specific thing, that you were never once, in your entire life, evaluated on your own. She had gone to a small college for art history and come home, and every job she'd ever had before the marriage had been in a building her father owned. Then she married a man who had built something out of a garage, and for 4 years she got to stand next to it and be part of it. And it is entirely possible that those were the best 4 years of her life. What broke was not love. What broke was rank. Because as the company grew, the thing Bryony was good at, the brand, the proposals, the relationships, became a department, and the department reported to an operations structure, and the operations structure reported to the man she was married to. And a woman who has spent 35 years never being evaluated on her own suddenly found herself, for the first time, on an org chart. She said something to Soren about it once, in year 5, in a car, and what she said was, "Do you know that people in that building talk to me like I'm the boss's wife?" And Soren Vandenberg, a man who had never in his life understood status as a real force, who thought it was a kind of weather other people worried about, said the single worst possible sentence, which was, "Who cares what they think? You know what you do." He meant it kindly. He meant, your work is real, the opinions aren't. She heard, "You're not going to fix it." He replayed that one about 900 times too. Killian Roundtree, whatever else he was extremely good at one thing, and it was not engineering. It was arriving in a room and immediately identifying the person who feels least seen and then seeing them, relentlessly, for as long as it takes. He did it to Hugo first, a 68-year-old man who had built 6 dealerships and was surrounded by people who treated him as a wallet. He did it to Bryony second. He asked her opinion in meetings. He wrote it down when she answered. He used her name in front of her father. That is the entire mechanism. There is no more to it than that. And by the time Niall Oglesby saw a truck in a driveway at 11:40 at night, it had already been going on for 9 months, and it had never once, at any point, required anybody to be a mastermind. Soren figured out the rest of the shape of it in the second week of his 5 weeks of reading, and he figured it out from a document nobody would ever look at twice, the company's professional liability insurance renewal application. It was a routine form, 40 pages, that Kat printed every February. Soren had signed 8 of them, and question 14, Part C, asked for the name, license number, and years of experience of each professional engineer employed by the applicant. The February application, the one submitted 6 weeks before the board meeting, listed one name, which meant that at the moment they were planning to fire him, somebody in that building had already sat down and filled out a form that said, in writing, to an insurance carrier, that the firm's entire professional capacity consisted of Soren Vandenberg. He photographed it with his phone, not to use. He has never used it. It sat in Jessamy Wace's file for 2 years and was never filed with anything. He photographed it because he wanted to know, for himself, standing in a supply room at 9 at night, whether they understood what they were doing or whether they simply had not looked. They had not looked. That was the answer. It was all through the file. A company that had grown from a garage to 31 people so fast that nobody had ever gone back and read what held it together. And a chairman who had spent 30 years never needing to read anything because he could always find somebody to explain it to him in a way that suited him. That is not a conspiracy. That is worse. A conspiracy has to be careful. The board meeting was on the 11th of April at 9 o'clock in the morning. Soren knew what it was going to be by the Thursday before, because Catriona Lamphere, Kat, who had run the front office since there were 9 people in the building and who had a nephew on Niall's crew, printed the packets. And Kat had come into his office at 10 to 5 with her mouth in a very straight line and said, "There's an executive session on the agenda and I wasn't asked to take minutes for it." Soren said, "Thank you, Kat." She said, "Do you want me to?" "No. Do everything exactly the way you always do it. Don't change one thing." He looked up. And Kat, "On Monday, whatever happens this week, you keep doing your job like nothing happened, and you say yes to anybody who asks you anything." You do not go down with this. Understood? Catriona Lamphere, who was 56 and had 2 grandchildren and a mortgage, looked at him for a second and said, "Understood," and then went home and cried in her car, which he did not find out about for a year. On Sunday night, he sat on the floor of Elowen's room while she read to him. She was 12 and had decided reading aloud to a parent was babyish, and had then, without acknowledging any inconsistency, continued to do it every Sunday. He said, "Hey, if things at work got weird for a while, like if I was around the house more, or if your mom and I were figuring some stuff out, would that be okay?" Elowen Vandenberg turned a page and said, "Is this the divorce conversation?" He said, "It's the maybe conversation." She said, "Okay." And then, after about 10 seconds, without looking up, "Is it because of Killian?" Soren did not answer that for a while. Then he said, "It's because of a lot of things, and none of them are you, and I'm not going anywhere." And his daughter said, "Okay," and kept reading. And that was the only part of the entire year that he could not talk about afterward without stopping. On Tuesday, the 11th of April, he wore the gray suit. He got to the building at 7, which was normal. He signed 2 sets of shop drawings, which was normal. At 8:20, he walked out to the yard and found Niall Oglesby and told him exactly what he thought was about to happen, and exactly what he wanted Niall to do about it, which was nothing. "Nothing," said Niall. "You've got 41 guys with families. If you walk out with me, you're a hero for about 11 days, and then you're a foreman with no job in a county with 2 employers." Soren put his hand on the man's shoulder. "You stay. You do the work. You keep everybody's paycheck coming. And Niall, in about 3 weeks, somebody's going to ask you to sign something." "Don't sign what?" "I don't know yet. Anything." The board met at 9 in the conference room Soren had specified the electrical for. There were 6 people at that table. Hugo Musgrave at the head, which was Soren's chair. Bryony to his right. Killian Roundtree, who was not a director, sitting in as COO. The outside director, a retired banker named Yannick Beauchamp, looking at the table. A corporate lawyer from Columbus that Soren had never met, with a folder. And Soren. Hugo did not wait for the minutes. He did not wait for anything. He had been waiting for 4 years, and the waiting was the part he was worst at. He said, "We need to cut dead weight." And he pointed at his son-in-law. "You're fired. You're a loser. Pack your trash and get lost." There is a thing that happens to a room when a man says something like that out loud. It is not shock. It is a kind of physical embarrassment. A wave of it. And every person at that table felt it, except the man who had spoken. Yannick Beauchamp studied the table, and Bryony Vandenberg, who had been married to Soren for 7 years, who had held his hand at his mother's funeral, who had named their daughter after a tree from a book she'd loved at 9, leaned forward slightly and said, "My new boyfriend will replace you. I want a divorce. You get nothing." It landed exactly the way she wanted it to. Soren looked at her for about 2 seconds. He was aware that everybody was waiting for him to do something, and that whatever he did in the next few seconds was the thing that would be described in this county for 10 years. So he said, "Okay." Then he turned to the lawyer from Columbus and said, "Is this a termination without cause?" The lawyer, who had been prepared for shouting, said, "The company is exercising its rights under Section 7 of your employment agreement. Without cause. There's a severance provision. I'm not asking about severance. I'm asking you to say it." The lawyer glanced at Hugo. Hugo, who had never once in his life declined to double down, said, "Damn right it's without cause. There's no cause. You just aren't any good at this." "Thank you," said Soren. He stood up. Hugo said, "You've got 1 hour to clear your office. Killian will walk you." Soren said, "That's fine." He used 30 minutes. He did not take a stapler, a picture frame, a coffee cup, a single sheet of company paper, or 1 byte of company data. Killian Roundtree stood in the doorway the entire time with his arms folded, occasionally saying things like, "No hard feelings, man," and Soren answered exactly none of them. He took 4 things. His father's framed photograph off the wall, Tobin Vandenberg at 26, sitting on a beam over the Muskingum with his boots hanging in the air. His personal laptop, which he showed Killian, opened, and let him look at. The framed professional engineer license, which was issued to a human being and hung on a wall of a building that human being no longer worked in. And out of his desk drawer, a small, heavy object about the size of a fist, a self-inking seal with a raised die in it, bearing a name, a number, and the words, State of Ohio, Professional Engineer. Killian actually said, "You're taking the stamp," and Soren Vandenberg said the only sentence he said to him that day, which was, "It has my name on it." He walked out at 10:14. Kat Lamphere was at the front desk with her eyes fixed on a monitor, and he did not put her in the position of saying anything, so he just knocked twice on the counter as he passed, which was what he had done every day for 11 years, and kept walking. Nobody else came out, which was correct, which he had asked for, and which still felt like being buried. He sat in his truck in his own parking lot for 4 minutes. Then he drove 9 miles into Ipswich Falls and parked outside a 2-story brick building on Main Street with a hand-lettered window that said, "The Dunkirk County Register, EST, 1889, and he went inside with a manila folder. It was 10:41 in the morning on a Tuesday. The deadline for Wednesday's edition was 4 p.m. Monday, which had passed. The next available edition was Wednesday the 19th. He booked 3 notices, prepaid, $384, and the woman at the counter read them back to him one at a time in a completely flat voice, the way you would read back a carpet cleaning ad. The first was headed Notice of Withdrawal of Designated Engineer. The second was headed Notice of Termination of Authority to affix Professional Seal. The third was headed Notice to Owners, Sureties, and Contracting Agencies. Then he drove to the post office and sent 4 certified letters, return receipt requested, which cost him another $31.80. One to the Ohio State Board of Registration for Professional Engineers and Surveyors. One to the Ohio Department of Transportation, District 5, attention of the project engineer on project number 194217, the Kesterline River Crossing. One to the surety, care of Ulrich Goodloe. And one to the corporate secretary of Vandenberg Structural Inc., which was, as of that morning, Killian Roundtree. Every one of them said the same thing in about 4 sentences, that the undersigned had ceased employment on this date, that he therefore withdrew as the firm's designated engineer under ORC 4733.16, that he revoked all authority for any person or entity to affix, reproduce, or rely upon his professional seal after this date, and that he remained personally available, at his own cost, to answer any question relating to any work he had sealed, for as long as anyone cared to ask. That last sentence was Jessamy Wace's idea, and it is the single most devastating line in this entire story, and it took Soren a week to understand why. Because it made him unimpeachable. He was not sabotaging a project. He was not endangering the public. He was doing the precise opposite. He was the responsible engineer, discharging his responsibility perfectly, on the record, offering his continued help. He was, in writing, the only adult in the county. Then he drove home and made his daughter macaroni. For 7 days, nothing happened. That is the part people find hardest to believe, and it is the most important week in the story. Hugo Musgrave spent it doing exactly what he had planned to do. He told the staff at an all-hands on Wednesday that the company was entering a new phase. He moved Killian Roundtree into the corner office. He had a sign company out to price new lettering for the building because he intended to rename it Musgrave Bridge and Marine. Bryony spent it filing for divorce. Her attorney's cover letter, which arrived at Jessamy Wace's office on Friday, was 4 pages long and contained the phrase, "the marital estate," consisting principally of the husband's 51% interest in Vandenberg Structural Inc. Jessamy Wace read that sentence, put the letter down, and laughed for a full 10 seconds, alone, in her office. And Soren Vandenberg spent it registering a business. It cost $99. He filed it online from his kitchen on the Thursday. Vandenberg Engineering, LLC, a single-member professional limited liability company with 1 licensed engineer in it, which is the smallest legal unit of the practice of engineering in the state of Ohio, and which is exactly as authorized to seal a bridge drawing as a firm with 300 employees. Then he applied for his own certificate of authorization, which took 11 days, and his own ODOT pre-qualification, which, because pre-qualification attaches to the qualifications of the individual, he received in 19, in the same categories he had held for 6 years. He also, on the advice of Jessamy Wace, did one more thing. and it was the cruelest thing in the story, and it was 100% proper. He wrote to every single client of Vandenberg Structural for whom he had personally sealed work in the previous 10 years, 81 letters, informing them that he had left the firm, that his seal remained on their drawings and remained valid, and that he was personally available to answer any question about that work at no charge. That is a professional obligation. It is arguably required. Jessamy made sure the wording could not be read as solicitation, and it never once said, "Hire me." 41 of them called him inside a month. On Wednesday, the 19th of April, the Dunkirk County Register came out. Nobody at Vandenberg Structural read it. Why would they? At 8:52 that morning, a woman named in nobody's story at a surety agency in Columbus, whose entire job is to scan legal notices for one specific phrase, found the phrase and walked it down the hall to Ulrich Goodloe, who had been waiting for it for 5 weeks and had already drafted what he was going to send. At 9:31, the surety issued a notice to Vandenberg Structural Inc., copying the Ohio Department of Transportation, stating that the principal had experienced a change in key personnel material to the underwriting of bond number 4471B, that the surety was suspending consent to any further contract increases, and that continuation of the bond was under review. At 10:04, the ODOT District 5 project engineer for Project 1942-17, a woman named Valentina Stiles, who had also received a certified letter the previous Thursday and had put it in a file because it was, at that point, an internal matter for the contractor, opened her email, read the surety's notice, and did what any state project engineer would do, which was pull the contract and check who the engineer of record was. At 10:20, she called the contractor. She asked one question: "Who is your engineer of record?" There was a pause on the phone of about 9 seconds, and then Killian Roundtree said, "I am." Valentina Stiles said, "What's your license number?" There is a very short list of moments in a working life that a person does not recover from, and that was one, and it took 4 seconds. By 11:15, the Kesterline River crossing was under a stop work order. Not for safety. Nothing on that bridge was unsafe. Every drawing already sealed was valid, and Soren had said so in writing to 4 separate parties. It stopped because a design-build project cannot proceed without a designated engineer of record who is willing to accept professional responsibility for the remaining design, and Vandenberg Structural, as of 10:14 a.m. on the 11th of April, did not have a single licensed engineer in the building. They had 11 engineers in training. They had 2 drafters with associate degrees. They had a COO whose license had lapsed in 2019. They had 30 days under the statute to designate a replacement. They had, on the Kesterline contract, liquidated damages of $14,200 per calendar day. The first call to Soren Vandenberg's cell phone came at 11:38 a.m. on the 19th of April. He was under a bridge in Guernsey County at the time. A county job, his own, $99 of LLC and a truck, with his phone in the cab, and he did not hear it. By the time he came up at 2:40 in the afternoon, there were 88 missed calls. He sat on the tailgate and scrolled through them. Hugo Musgrave, 31. The office main line, 19. Killian Roundtree, 14. Brioni, 9. Yannick Beauchamp, the outside director who had studied the table, 4. 2 numbers he didn't know that turned out to be the Columbus lawyer, and Kat Lamphere. 1, at 12:10, with a voicemail that was 11 seconds long and said, "Soren, it's Kat. I'm not asking you for anything. I just wanted to say I hope you're okay. That's all." He listened to that one twice. Then he called Jessamy Wace and said, "It started." And Jessamy Wace said, "Do not answer a single one of them. Not one. If they want to talk to you, they can write to me, and I will tell you what it says." Here is what those 88 calls were about, and it is not what people assume. They were not asking him to come back. Not at first. On day 1, Hugo Musgrave was still Hugo Musgrave, and the first 11 calls, according to the voicemails Jessamy later transcribed for the record, were threats. He was going to sue him. He was going to have his license pulled. He was going to make sure he never worked in this state again. He had destroyed a company on purpose out of spite, and Hugo had witnesses, and there were laws about this. There are in fact laws about this, and Jessamy Wace responded to all of it with a 2-page letter that has been, I am told, photocopied and passed around 3 county bar associations since. It said, in substance, my client was terminated without cause on the 11th of April, a fact established on the record by the chairman himself in front of 5 witnesses. Upon separation, ORC 4733.16 required him to withdraw as designated engineer. Failure to do so would itself have been a violation. His revocation of seal authority is likewise mandatory. He gave written notice to the board, the licensing authority, the owner, and the surety on the day of separation, and has offered, and continues to offer, his professional assistance at no charge on all work he sealed. Then the last paragraph, which is the one that got photocopied. Your client's position appears to be that my client was simultaneously so unimportant that he could be dismissed as dead weight, and so essential that his lawful departure has halted a $38 million public project. Both propositions cannot be true. My client did not create that contradiction. He merely declined to keep concealing it. The 30 days between the 12th of April and the 11th of May are, from the inside of that building, the part of the story I find hardest to hear about, and I have it mostly from Kat Lamphere, who kept doing her job exactly as instructed, and from Niall Oglesby, who kept 41 men working for as long as there was work. Week 1 was denial, and it was cheerful. Killian ran an all hands and used the phrase, the next chapter 4 times. 2 people got promoted. There was a cake. Week 2 was procedural. Somebody found the words, designated engineer, in the certificate and asked what that meant, and got an answer from a lawyer in Columbus, and the answer took 90 minutes and ended with a recommendation to retain a search firm. Week 3 was money. The search firm quoted a fee. The first 3 candidates read the project scope and declined a phone call. Hugo doubled the offer. 2 more declined. Week 4 was when Kat Lamphere was asked to sign something. It was Wednesday afternoon. Killian brought it to her desk himself, friendly, and it was a transmittal cover sheet, the routine 1-page form that goes on top of a set of drawings when they go to the owner, and he asked her to sign it in the box marked for the firm. Kat Lamphere had typed 10,000 of those in 11 years. She looked at the drawings underneath it. They were sealed. The seal on them was Soren Vandenberg's, scanned, on a sheet dated the 2nd of May, which was 3 weeks after he had left the building and had revoked, in writing, by certified mail, to 4 separate parties, all authority for any person to affix or reproduce that seal. Somebody had copied a stamp out of an old file. Kat Lamphere was 56 and had 2 grandchildren and a mortgage, and had been told, by a man in a gray suit on a Thursday in April, "You say yes to anybody who asks you anything. You do not go down with this." She said, "I'm not signing that." Killian said, "Kat, it's a transmittal. It's nothing." And Catriona Lamphere, who had never once raised her voice in that building, said, "Then you sign it." He didn't. The drawings never went out. She kept the transmittal sheet in her desk for 4 months, and then gave it to Padraig Grimsby at the State Board, who described it in his report as the single most important document in the investigation, and it is the reason the Roundtree matter was resolved in 9 weeks instead of 2 years. She never told Soren she had it. He found out from the board's published order. He drove to her house on a Sunday and stood on her porch and could not get a sentence out, and Kat Lamphere said, "Oh, stop it," and made him come in and eat something. By day 9, they stopped threatening. By day 14, Hugo Musgrave drove out to a county road in Guernsey County, in a Lincoln, and found his son-in-law standing in a creek bed in waders, with a crack comparator in his hand. He came down the bank in dress shoes. He was 68. He nearly went over twice, and he stood there on the gravel and said, "What do you want?" Soren looked up from the abutment. He said, "Hugo, you have to talk to my attorney." "Damn your attorney. What do you want?" "A number. Give me a number." And this is the part that people misunderstand about revenge, and it is the reason I wanted to tell this one. Soren Vandenberg did not have a number. He genuinely did not want one. He had spent 5 weeks in a dark kitchen building an inventory, and the entire inventory had been defensive. It was a list of things he was holding, so that he would know what he was setting down. He had never planned a demand. There was nothing to demand. He had a license, a truck, a daughter, and $99 of LLC. And for the first time in 6 years, he was not in a company with 3 votes that had dinner together. So he told the truth, which was the most annihilating thing available. He said, "I don't want anything, Hugo. That's the problem." Hugo Musgrave stood in a creek bed in his good shoes and, for the first time in his adult life, encountered a machine he could not operate. The 30 days ran out on the 11th of May. They tried. It is worth being fair about how hard they tried, because the trying is where the whole thing came apart in public. Vandenberg Structural needed a licensed Ohio professional engineer, willing to be designated as the firm's responsible engineer, and willing to be named engineer of record on a half-built $38 million river crossing designed by somebody else. Hugo Musgrave offered a great deal of money for that. He got 11 interviews and 4 offers considered and 0 acceptances. And the reason is a thing every engineer understands and almost nobody else does. When you seal a drawing, you are not signing a receipt. You are personally, individually, professionally accepting responsibility for that structure. And that responsibility does not expire when you quit. And it does not attach to the company. And it cannot be indemnified away. And if that bridge ever does anything unexpected, it is your name on the front of the sheet in a deposition 20 years from now. Nobody accepts another man's calculations on a river crossing for a stranger's money. 2 of the 11 interviewees called Soren Vandenberg to ask him about it, because that is what you do, and he told both of them the truth. The design was good. He stood behind every sheet. He'd sit with them for free for as long as it took. And no, he would not advise them to take it, because the firm now had nobody who could check their work. Both of them wrote back to Hugo and said no. The certificate of authorization was suspended on the 12th of May. The stop work order on Kesterline had run 23 days by then. Liquidated damages, $326,600. The surety declined continuation of the bond on the 18th. ODOT issued a notice of default on the 24th and terminated for convenience on the 9th of June, which is the merciful version, and re-let the remaining work in August. Vandenberg Structural's other 12 active contracts, county work mostly, load ratings and culverts, were all engineering contracts, and every one of them required a firm holding a valid certificate. They died in a week. 31 people lost their jobs across 2 months. That is the true cost of this story, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. And neither did Soren, and it is the thing he still does not talk about easily. 22 of them worked for him again within a year, which is not absolution, but it is something. Niall Oglesby was the first, hired on the 1st of July as superintendent of a firm that at that point consisted of Niall, Soren, and a truck. Kat Lamphere was the second, on the 15th, and she cried in her car again, differently. And when ODOT re-let the remaining Kesterline work in August, there were 4 pre-qualified bidders in the state in the relevant categories. One of them was a firm of 3 people in a rented unit in Ipswich Falls, whose principal engineer had personally designed and sealed every sheet of the original drawings, could answer any question about any of them without opening a book, and did not need to be paid to get up to speed on anything. Vandenberg Engineering LLC did not underbid anybody. Soren specifically refused to. Jessamy Wace was adamant, and she was right. The appearance mattered more than the margin. He came in 3rd lowest of 4, and he won it on qualifications, which is how design-build works, and the award was in November. The divorce was final in February. Briony Vandenberg's petition had been built, as her attorney's cover letter said, on the marital estate, consisting principally of the husband's 51% interest in Vandenberg Structural, Inc. By February, that interest had a valuation. A 51% stake in a corporation with a suspended certificate of authorization, no active contracts, a defaulted bond, a terminated public project, and $326,000 of liquidated damages assessed against it was worth, in the words of the neutral valuator both attorneys agreed on, a soft-spoken man from Cleveland who did this for a living and had clearly enjoyed himself, negative equity, with the precise figure dependent on the outcome of the surety's subrogation claim, she had said. You get nothing. She had been correct. She had simply misidentified who you was, because the asset she was fighting for was the one her father had spent 5 months detonating, and the thing Soren actually owned, a license issued by the state of Ohio to a human being. which cannot be divided, assigned, transferred, sold, or awarded to a spouse in a decree, had never been marital property in any state in the country, and never will be. She got the house, which he did not contest for a second. She got half the retirement accounts, which he did not contest either. She got the cars. They split custody of Elowen 50-50, and Soren agreed to that in about 4 seconds too, in front of a mediator, and Jessamy Wace told him afterward it was the only time in the entire proceeding she'd seen the other side's attorney look uncomfortable, because he never once used the daughter, not as leverage, not in an affidavit, not in a single filing. Killian Roundtree was referred to the Ohio Board for the unlicensed practice of engineering, and for holding himself out as a professional engineer, which is a first-degree misdemeanor in that state. And the board's investigator, a patient man named Padraig Grimsby who had been doing that job for 19 years, found 41 separate instances in emails, business cards, a LinkedIn profile, and 1 proposal cover page. He was fined, permanently barred from reinstatement in Ohio, without a full re-examination he has. Never sat, and he moved to Kentucky and sells industrial coatings. He and Bryony lasted 11 months. Hugo Musgrave did not go bankrupt. He was a wealthy man before any of this, and he was a somewhat less wealthy man after it, and the $2.6 million he had put into a company in year 2 was gone along with the $400,000 of personal indemnity he'd signed on the bond, and the dealerships were fine. What ended was something else. Hugo Musgrave had spent 30 years being the biggest man in a small county, and in a county with 11,000 newspaper subscribers, everybody now knew, not as gossip, as published record, that he had stood up in a room and called the man who was the legal foundation of his own company dead weight, and then discovered what the word foundation meant. He resigned from 2 boards that spring. Nobody asked him to. Soren and Elowen still eat macaroni on Sundays, and she is 16 now and has opinions about everything, including, extensively, engineering, which she says she is definitely not going to study. Vandenberg Engineering has 19 people. The sign on the building is not fancy. The Kesterline River crossing opened on a Thursday in the spring 2 years later. There was a ribbon. A state representative spoke for 6 minutes. Nobody from the family came. Soren stood at the back with Niall Oglesby, and when the first loaded truck went across, he did the thing his father used to do, which is put a hand flat on the rail and leave it there for a second. Niall said, "Well?" And Soren Vandenberg said, "That's fine. Here is the thing I keep turning over, and it is not the wife, and it is not the father-in-law. It's the word. Dead weight. That's a real engineering term. It's not an insult in that building. It's the load of the structure itself, the concrete, the steel, the deck, the part that isn't traffic and isn't wind and isn't anything happening. Just the mass of the thing standing there, doing nothing, all day, forever. And here's what every structural engineer knows, and Hugo Musgrave did not. Dead load is the load the whole design is sized for. It is the biggest number on the sheet. Traffic comes and goes. Wind is occasional. Dead load never leaves, and if you remove it, the structure does not get lighter and stronger. It gets unstable. Because everything else was calculated against it. So the man at the head of that table pointed at the one component holding his company up, called it dead weight, and removed it, and then spent a year being astonished that the rest of it did not stand. Which brings me to the only thing I actually want you to take out of this. Somewhere in your working life there is a thing you carry that nobody thanks you for. It's the license, the certification, the clearance, the relationship, the one client who only ever answers your calls, the process only you know how to run. It is invisible, it is unglamorous, and because you have never made a fuss about it, everybody around you has quietly filed it under just how things are. Go and find out what it actually is. Not so you can threaten anybody. Soren never threatened anybody, and that's precisely why it worked. Find out, because a person who does not know what he carries cannot tell the difference between being undervalued and being load-bearing. And those two things call for completely different lives. And if you ever do find yourself in a room where somebody points at you and says the words dead weight, don't argue. Ask them, very politely, to put it in the minutes. I'm Nathan. Thanks for staying to the end of this one.